The spring trading gathering along the Connecticut River brought together trappers, native peoples, and merchants from across the region, creating a temporary village of tents and shelters where furs changed hands for tools, where rumors spread faster than river currents, and where unlikely encounters could alter destinies in unexpected ways. Among the crowds moved a compact man whose weathered face suggested more years than his actual age, his pack of premium beaver pelts marking him as successful despite his unimpressive physical stature, his accent revealing French-Canadian origins that made some English settlers view him with suspicion. He had heard the whispers that followed him through every gathering, the barely concealed amusement about the short trapper who somehow thrived in a profession dominated by larger, stronger men. But he had long ago stopped caring what others thought about his size. What he could not know was that within hours, he would meet someone who would make him question everything he believed about himself, about love, and about the courage required to claim happiness in a world obsessed with appearances that meant nothing. If stories about love that defies expectations speak to your heart, consider subscribing to discover how true connection transcends what the world considers important. The year 1738 marked Henri du Bois's 8th season, working the Northern Territories as an independent trapper. He had arrived in the colonies as a teenager, fleeing a difficult family situation in Quebec, and had discovered that the wilderness valued skills and determination over the social hierarchies that had made his life miserable in settled areas. His father, a failed farmer who blamed his own inadequacies on everyone around him, had mocked Henri relentlessly for being the smallest of 5 sons, treating him as worthless despite the boy's intelligence and capability. Henri stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, unusually short even by the standards of an era when most men topped out around 5 feet 8. His slight build made him appear almost childlike next to the burly trappers and traders who dominated the profession, and he had endured countless jokes and dismissive treatment throughout his early years in the wilderness. But Henri possessed qualities that mattered more than height in the unforgiving forests. He could move silently through dense undergrowth, fit into spaces larger men could not access, required less food to sustain himself on long expeditions, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read animal behavior and anticipate their movements. These advantages had made him wealthy by trapper standards. His furs were always premium quality because his patience allowed him to be selective, and his low overhead meant he could wait for the best prices rather than selling desperately. At 26 years old, Henri had saved enough money to potentially purchase land and establish a more permanent life, but he had no clear vision of what that life might look like. The isolation that made him successful in trapping also left him deeply lonely, and the few attempts he had made to court women in the settlements had ended in humiliation when they made clear that his stature disqualified him regardless of his financial prospects. The trading gathering offered a rare opportunity for social interaction, and Henri moved through the crowded area observing the fascinating mixture of cultures and languages. He had picked up enough Mohican and Algonquin to conduct basic trade negotiations, and his French-English bilingualism gave him advantages with certain merchants. Near a cluster of native shelters, he noticed a group of Mohican villagers who had brought exquisite baskets and beadwork to trade. One woman in particular caught his attention, not initially because of her appearance, but because of the way others seemed to give her excessive space, creating an invisible boundary that suggested discomfort or perhaps respect. When she stood to demonstrate the quality of a basket to a potential buyer, Henri understood immediately what made her remarkable. The woman was extraordinarily tall, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches, which would have been notable for a man, and was absolutely exceptional for a woman of any background. She moved with careful control, as if constantly aware of her unusual stature and trying to minimize it, keeping her shoulders slightly hunched and her head lowered in a posture that suggested years of attempting to appear smaller than she was. Henri found himself staring, not with a mockery or discomfort he saw on other faces, but with genuine fascination. Her height gave her a striking presence that transcended conventional standards of beauty. She had strong features, intelligent dark eyes, and hands that moved with remarkable grace despite their size. There was something deeply appealing about her quiet dignity, the way she conducted herself with calm professionalism despite the obvious discomfort her appearance created in others. She seemed both powerful and vulnerable simultaneously, and Henri recognized that contradiction because he lived it himself in the opposite direction. He approached her display of goods, genuinely interested in purchasing a basket for storing his trapping supplies. as he examined her work up close. He was struck by the incredible craftsmanship, the intricate patterns woven with such precision that they seemed impossible to create by hand. He asked about her techniques in his halting Mohican, and she responded in surprisingly fluent English, explaining her process with obvious pride in her skills. Her voice was low and musical, and when she smiled at his genuine interest in her work, her entire face transformed into something luminous. They negotiated a fair price, and Henri paid without the haggling that characterized most transactions at these gatherings. As she carefully wrapped his purchase, their hands touched briefly, and he felt an electric awareness that he had never experienced before. She looked directly at him then, and for a moment, their eyes held, two people accustomed to being judged for their physical differences, recognizing something essential in each other. The moment passed quickly as other customers approached, but Henri walked away with more than a basket. He carried a memory of that brief connection with an intensity that surprised him. Over the next 2 days, Henri found excuses to return to her area of the gathering. He learned her name was Onata, which meant daughter of the earth in her language, a name her mother had given her with hope she would grow strong and grounded. She was 23 years old, unmarried despite being well past the typical age for Mohican women to wed, and she lived with her aging parents in a village about 2 days' journey upriver. Her exceptional height had been apparent from early childhood, and while her family loved her, the broader community had never quite known what to do with a woman who stood taller than most of their warriors. Onata had been rejected by every potential husband who had been proposed for her. Some men found her stature intimidating, fearing it suggested she would dominate the relationship or make them appear weak by comparison. Others simply found her too unusual, too far outside the norms of what a wife should look like. The accumulated rejections had created deep wounds that she hid beneath practical competence and emotional reserve. She had resigned herself to permanent spinsterhood, finding purpose in her crafts and in caring for her parents, trying not to think about the loneliness that shadowed her days. Henri sensed this pain because it mirrored his own experiences. They began talking more extensively, finding private moments away from the crowds where they could speak freely. He told her about his childhood of mockery, about his father's cruelty, about learning that the wilderness cared nothing for height, but everything for skill and determination. She shared her own stories of feeling like a perpetual outsider, of watching friends marry, and of children while she remained alone, of the desperate attempts she had made to appear smaller and less noticeable that only emphasized her difference. Their conversations flowed with an ease that felt miraculous to both of them. They discovered shared interests in the natural world, similar senses of humor, and compatible values about honesty and loyalty. Henri made Onata laugh with stories about outsmarting larger trappers through clever positioning and patience, and she impressed her with her extensive knowledge of plants and their medicinal uses. For the first time in years, both of them felt truly seen by another person, valued for who they were rather than dismissed for how they appeared. On the 4th day of the gathering, Henri realized with startling clarity that he was falling in love with Onata. The recognition hit him while watching her negotiate with a difficult merchant who tried to undervalue her work. She stood her ground calmly, explaining the hours of labor and skill required for each piece, refusing to be cheated simply because the merchant assumed a woman would accept whatever price he offered. Her quiet strength and refusal to diminish herself despite years of rejection stirred something profound in Henri's chest, a feeling he convinced himself he would never experience. But alongside this realization came crushing doubt. What could he possibly offer a woman who had been rejected by men of her own people, men who at least shared her culture and stood closer to her impressive height? He was not only from a different world, but also significantly shorter than she was. Standing beside Onata, the top of Henri's head barely reached her shoulder. The physical disparity was so pronounced that he knew they would face mockery and judgment far exceeding what either had experienced individually. The practical voice in his head insisted he should enjoy her friendship during this brief gathering, and then return to his solitary life without complicating matters with impossible romantic aspirations. Yet Henri could not bring himself to maintain that emotional distance. On the 5th evening, as the gathering began winding down with many traders preparing to depart the following morning, he invited Onata to walk with him along the river. The spring air was mild and fragrant with new growth, and the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, both aware that their time together was ending, that tomorrow would separate them back into their individual lonely existences. Henri struggled to find words adequate for what he wanted to express. His French and English education had not prepared him for articulating feelings this complex, and he feared that anything he said would sound foolish or presumptuous. But the possibility of letting Onata leave without knowing how deeply she had affected him felt worse than the risk of rejection. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his heart hammering so violently he wondered if she could hear it. He told her plainly that he had never met anyone like her, that their conversations had been a highlight of his entire year, that her strength and intelligence and kindness had awakened feelings he had convinced himself were impossible for someone like him. He admitted his awareness that he was shorter than any man she might reasonably consider, that their pairing would seem absurd to observers from both their cultures, but that he could not let her disappear from his life without at least expressing what she had come to mean to him in such a short time. Onata listened without interrupting, her expression difficult to read in the fading light. When Henri finished his awkward declaration, she was quiet for a long moment, and he braced himself for the gentle rejection he assumed was coming. Instead, she asked him a question that revealed the depth of her own wounds. She wanted to know if he truly found her appealing, or if he simply saw her as the only woman who might accept someone of his stature, a practical arrangement between two people that nobody else wanted. The question struck Henri like a physical blow, both because it revealed how profoundly rejection had damaged her self-perception, and because it suggested she had been thinking about him in similar terms. He responded with more passion than he had intended, insisting that her height was not something he tolerated, but something he genuinely admired, that her physical presence matched her inner strength, that she deserved someone who appreciated rather than apologized for her exceptional nature. He told her that yes, their size difference was dramatic and would certainly invite comment, but that he found her beautiful precisely as she was, not despite her stature, but including it as part of what made her remarkable. Onata's eyes glistened with moisture, and her voice shook slightly as she revealed she had spent the entire gathering hoping Henri might express such feelings, but fearing she was projecting her own desperate wishes onto friendly conversation. She admitted that his height had never bothered her, that she had actually found it refreshing to speak with someone who did not try to dominate her physically or seem threatened by her presence. She said she had been rejected so many times for being too tall that she had started to believe something was fundamentally wrong with her, that she was unlovable because of a characteristic she could not control. Henri reached up to touch her face, his hand gentle against her cheek, and told her firmly that there was nothing wrong with her, that the men who had rejected her were fools who could not see past superficial appearances to recognize an extraordinary woman. Onata leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, and whispered that she had never imagined someone would say such things to her and genuinely mean them. They stood together as darkness fell around them, two wounded people offering each other the acceptance and appreciation they had both been denied by a world obsessed with conformity. The following morning brought practical complications that neither had fully considered in the emotional intensity of the previous evening. Onata's parents expected her to return with them to their village, and Henri had planned to head north into trapping territories. Long-term separation seemed inevitable unless they could develop some plan that accommodated both their responsibilities and desires. They met early, before the gathering fully stirred to life, trying to solve problems that had no easy answers. Henri proposed that he could visit her village, that he could bring gifts and formally request permission to court her according to Mohican customs. Onata appreciated the gesture, but warned him that her community might not welcome a white trapper pursuing one of their women, regardless of his intentions. Intertribal and intercultural marriages happen occasionally, but they remain controversial and often created tension. Her parents were progressive by village standards, but even they might have concerns about their daughter choosing someone from such a different background. They debated various possibilities throughout the morning, aware that other people were beginning to notice their intense private conversations and were likely drawing conclusions. Henri caught several traders smirking and whispering, their gestures making clear they found the idea of the short Frenchman and the tall Mohican woman absurd. Onata's shoulders began hunching again in that defensive posture Henri had first noticed, and he gently reminded her to stand proud, that she had nothing to be ashamed of regardless of what small minds thought. By midday, they had settled on a tentative plan. Henri would complete one more trapping circuit, which would take approximately 6 weeks, and then he would travel to Onata's village with proper gifts and intentions. This delay would give her time to prepare her parents and community for his arrival, to explain their connection and hopefully build some acceptance before he appeared. It was far from ideal, requiring both of them to endure weeks of uncertainty, but it seemed the most respectful approach given the cultural complexities involved. As the gathering dispersed, Henri and Onata said goodbye with difficulty that surprised them both given how recently they had met. They had spent less than a week together, most of it in casual conversation amid crowds. Yet somehow that brief connection had shifted both their internal landscapes dramatically. Onata's family loaded their goods onto a canoe for the journey upriver, and Henri watched until they disappeared around a bend, feeling more alone than he had in years despite having spent most of his adult life in solitude. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest of Henry's life. He moved through his trapping routines mechanically, his mind constantly returned to conversations with Onata, replaying her laugh and the way her eyes lit up when discussing topics that interested her. He had always found contentment in the wilderness silence, but now it felt oppressive, filled with absence rather than peace. He caught himself talking aloud to her, as if she could hear him, explaining his techniques and sharing observations he thought she would find interesting. Henri completed his trapping circuit with unusual speed, driven by eagerness to reach Onata's village. He selected his finest furs not for sale, but as gifts, understanding that Mohican courtship protocols required demonstrating both respect and capability through generous offerings. He purchased additional trade goods that would be valued by her community, tobacco and steel tools and colorful cloth, investing a significant portion of his savings into this venture. The practical part of his mind warned that he was risking much on a relationship barely begun, but his heart insisted that some opportunities justified any gamble. The journey to her village took 3 days of steady travel through territories Henri knew only vaguely. He followed Onata's directions carefully, watching for the landmarks she had described, increasingly nervous as he drew closer to his destination. What if her parents refused to see him? What if the village elders forbade the match entirely? What if Onata herself had reconsidered during their separation, deciding that the complications outweighed whatever feelings had developed during those few days at the gathering? The doubts multiplied with each mile. But Henri pushed forward, knowing that retreat would haunt him forever. He reached the village in late afternoon, announcing himself from a respectful distance as Onata had instructed. Warriors approached with cautious curiosity, clearly surprised by the appearance of a lone white trapper seeking peaceful entry. Henri explained in his limited Mohican that he had come to visit Onata, that she was expecting him, and that he carried gifts for her family and community. The warriors exchanged glances that suggested this was not entirely unexpected news, and one of them went to summon the woman in question. When Onata emerged from a longhouse, Henry's breath caught at seeing her again. She wore traditional dress decorated with intricate beadwork, and her hair was arranged in a style that suggested special occasion. She had clearly prepared for his arrival, and the care she had taken with her appearance moved him deeply. But what struck him most was how she carried herself, standing fully upright without the defensive hunch he had seen at the gathering, her chin raised and her shoulders back in a posture of quiet pride. She greeted him formally in Mohican first, then switched to English, welcoming him to her village and thanking him for making the journey. Her eyes held warmth that contradicted the careful formality of her words, and Henri understood she was performing for observers, establishing proper protocol, while her true feelings remained carefully controlled. She led him to her parents' home, where he would be received according to custom, and he followed with a mixture of excitement and terror at the ordeal ahead. Onata's father, Tahaden, was a dignified man in his 60s, his face weathered by decades of outdoor life, his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to respect within the community. Her mother, Kimamila, was shorter than her daughter, but still tall for a woman, and Henri recognized immediately where Onata had inherited her exceptional stature. Both parents studied Henri with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts, and he felt scrutinized in ways that made him acutely aware of every inadequacy. Through Onata's translation, since his Mohican was insufficient for a complex discussion, Henri formally requested permission to court their daughter. He presented his gifts with proper respect, explaining his profession and his prospects, acknowledging that he came from a different culture, but emphasizing his genuine feelings for Onata and his willingness to learn and adapt. He spoke of the connection they had discovered at the gathering, of shared experiences with rejection and loneliness, of recognition that transcended cultural boundaries. Tahaten listened without interruption, his face impassive, while Kimamila occasionally glanced at her daughter with an expression Henri could not quite interpret. When Henri finished, a long silence followed that felt unbearably tense. Finally, Tahaten spoke at length to Mohican, his tone measured and serious, and Henri waited anxiously for Onata to translate his response. Her father acknowledged that Henry's gifts were generous and his words respectful. He stated that he and Kimamila had raised their daughter to be strong, capable, and independent, that they valued her happiness above conformity to expectations. He admitted that Onata's unusual height had caused her pain throughout her life, that they had watched with sadness as rejection after rejection damaged her spirit. He said they had noticed a change in her since the gathering, a lightness and hope that had been absent for years, and they attributed this transformation to whatever had developed between her and this French trapper. However, Tahaten continued, the decision was not as to make alone. Mohican custom required community input for marriages, particularly those involving outsiders. He proposed that Henri stay in the village for a period of time, that community members could observe him and assess his character, and that after appropriate deliberation, a decision would be reached. This was not refusal, Onata explained, but standard protocol, and it represented cautious openness rather than outright rejection. Henri agreed immediately, relieved to have any path forward. He was assigned a space in a communal longhouse designated for unmarried men and visitors, and over the following weeks, he immersed himself in village life with determined effort. He helped with whatever tasks were offered, from repairing structures to assisting with hunts, demonstrating skills and work ethic that gradually earned grudging respect. His small stature became less noteworthy as people recognized his capabilities, and his willingness to learn Mohican language and customs suggested genuine commitment rather than superficial interest. Onata and Henri were allowed to spend time together under community observation, walking through the village or sitting by the river, while technically chaperoned by younger siblings or curious children. These carefully monitored interactions had their own sweetness, forcing them to communicate through glances and careful words, building intimacy through restraint. They talked about futures they hoped to share, about how they might blend their different backgrounds into something new, about children who might inherit surprising combinations of traits from such unusual parents. But not everyone in the village welcomed Henry's presence or approved of the developing relationship. Several warriors made clear their disapproval, suggesting that Onata's rejection of Mohican men in favor of an outsider was an insult to their people. Some women whispered that she was betraying her culture, that her desperation for marriage had made her accept someone inappropriate. The criticism hurt Onata deeply, particularly when it came from people she had known her entire life. But Henri reminded her that they had both survived worse judgment, and that happiness was worth the cost of others' narrow opinions. The turning point came during a community hunt, when Henry's unconventional approach proved unexpectedly valuable. The hunters were pursuing a deer that had evaded them by moving through dense thickets where larger men struggled to follow. Henri, with his compact size and silent movement techniques, was able to track the animal through spaces others could not navigate, ultimately making a kill that provided meat for several families. The success earned him genuine respect from warriors who had previously dismissed him, demonstrating that different attributes had value in different contexts. After nearly 2 months in the village, Tahaten called a formal council to discuss Henri and Onata's request to marry. Community members voiced their opinions in a process that was remarkably democratic by European standards, with women's voices carrying equal weight to men's. Some spoke against a union, citing cultural differences and concerns about Onata leaving to live among colonists. Others defended the match, noting Henry's demonstrated character and arguing that Onata deserved happiness after years of loneliness. Onata herself was invited to speak, and she addressed the assembly with powerful eloquence. She acknowledged her unusual stature, the characteristic that had defined so much of her experience. She spoke the words that would become the heart of their story, stating plainly that she stood taller than any warrior in the village, that this truth had haunted her entire life, that she had believed it made her unlovable. Then she described Henry's response when she confronted him with this painful reality, how he had smiled not with mockery, but with genuine affection, and kissed her anyway, seeing her rather than her height, valuing her rather than measuring her. The assembly fell silent after Onata's declaration, her words hanging in the air with emotional weight that transcended cultural boundaries. She continued speaking, her voice steady despite obvious emotion, explaining that Henri had given her something no one else ever had, the freedom to stand at her full height without shame or apology. She said that love should not be measured in inches, but in the courage to see beyond what society deemed important, in the strength to choose connection over conformity. She asked the council to consider not what looked appropriate to outsiders, but what would bring genuine happiness to one of their own who had suffered enough rejection for circumstances beyond her control. Kimamila rose to speak then, supporting her daughter with words that clearly came from years of watching Onata's pain. She reminded the assembly that their people had survived by adapting, by valuing character over appearance, by recognizing that strength came in many forms. She pointed out that Henri had demonstrated respect for their ways, had worked hard to earn acceptance, and had shown Onata devotion that no Mohican suitor had ever offered. She argued that denying this match would be choosing pride over compassion, would be perpetuating the same narrow judgments that had caused Onata so much suffering. The council deliberated through the evening and into the night, voices rising and falling as different perspectives competed for dominance. Henri waited outside with Onata, both of them silent, holding hands in the darkness and trying not to imagine the devastation of rejection after coming so close to happiness. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, while inside the longhouse their future was being decided by people weighing tradition against individual fulfillment. Finally, as dawn began lightening the eastern sky, Tahadan emerged with the council's decision. His weathered face was difficult to read, and Henri felt his stomach clench with anticipation. The elder spoke in Mohican first, addressing his daughter, and Henri watched Onata's expression transform from anxiety to disbelief to overwhelming joy. She turned to Henri with tears streaming down her face and translated the verdict in a voice breaking with emotion. The council had approved their marriage, acknowledging that while unconventional, the match demonstrated qualities their people valued: mutual respect and genuine affection, and the courage to stand against judgment. The wedding was planned to the following month, allowing time for proper preparations and for Henri to send word to the few people in his life who might wish to attend. He dispatched a message to a fellow trapper who had always treated him fairly, inviting him to witness this unexpected turn in his solitary existence. The village transformed preparations into a community effort, with women creating special garments that blended Mohican and European elements, men organizing hunts to provide feast provisions, and children chattering excitedly about the unusual couple who would soon be joined. Onata worked alongside her mother and other women to create her wedding dress, an extraordinary garment that incorporated traditional beadwork with fabric Henri had brought as trade goods. She told Henri she wanted to honor both their backgrounds in the celebration, to create something new that acknowledged where they each came from while pointing toward what they would build together. The symbolism moved Henri deeply, this recognition that their union was not about one person abandoning their identity, but about two people creating a shared life that respected both their origins. In the days before the ceremony, Henri and Onata took long walks along the river, talking about their plans and dreams. Henri had decided to establish a more permanent home near the village, rather than continuing his nomadic trapping existence. He would still work the territories, but would have a base where Onata could maintain her craft work and where they could eventually raise a family they both hoped for. The compromise satisfied his need for independence, while keeping them connected to her community and culture. Onata confessed her anxieties about their physical differences, not because she doubted Henry's acceptance, but because she worried about practical matters. She wondered how they would navigate intimacy given their size disparity, whether childbirth might be complicated by her unusual stature, whether their children would face the same mockery she had endured. Henri listened patiently to each concern, acknowledging their validity while reassuring her that they would figure out solutions together, that every marriage faced challenges, and theirs would simply be more visible than most. The wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather, warm sunshine, and gentle breezes carrying the scent of blooming flowers. The ceremony blended Mohican traditions with a few European elements Henri had requested, creating a unique ritual that honored both their backgrounds. When Onata emerged in her wedding garments, standing at her full magnificent height with her head held high and pride radiating from every line of her body, Henri felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was absolutely stunning, powerful and feminine simultaneously, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was the luckiest man alive. They stood before the assembled community, Henri looking up at his bride, while she looked down at her groom, and when Tahatan invited them to speak their commitments, Henry's voice rang out clearly in his accented Mohican. He promised to honor Onata, to value her strength, to stand beside her regardless of what others thought, to build a life worthy of the gift she was giving him. Onata responded in both Mohican and English, promising to respect Henri, to appreciate his courage, to create a home where both their cultures were celebrated, to face whatever challenges came with the partnership they had chosen. The moment came for their first kiss as a married couple, and the gathered crowd fell silent, watching with fascination as the short French trapper reached up while the tall Mohican woman bent down, meeting in the middle with obvious affection that transcended their physical differences. Some observers smiled with genuine warmth, while others remained skeptical, but Henri and Onata were aware only of each other, of the joy and relief of finally claiming happiness after so many years of loneliness and rejection. The feast that followed was abundant and joyful, with music and dancing that continued long into the night. Henry's trapper friend arrived late, but embraced him with genuine congratulations, admitting he had never imagined the solitary Frenchman would find love, but declaring himself delighted to be proven wrong. The man's easy acceptance meant more to Henri than he could articulate. This validation from someone who understood the harsh judgment frontier society typically dispensed. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing, Henri and Onata retreated to the small dwelling that had been prepared for them, a structure built specifically for their new life together. Inside, away from observing eyes, they finally allowed themselves to fully acknowledge the magnitude of what they had achieved. Two people that society had deemed unmarriageable had found each other against improbable odds, had fought for acceptance despite mockery and doubt, and had created a partnership based on genuine recognition rather than settling for whatever scraps others might offer. Onata spoke the words that had defined their courtship, reminding Henri that she stood taller than any warrior, taller than seemed proper for a woman, taller than most people found comfortable. Henri pulled her close and repeated his response, that he saw her completely, that her height was part of her magnificence, that he chose her precisely as she was with full awareness and absolute certainty. He kissed her then with a passion that had been carefully restrained during their chaperone courtship, and she responded with matching intensity, years of loneliness and pain dissolving in the reality of being genuinely wanted. Their marriage became something of a legend in the region, talked about in both native communities and settler gatherings as an example of unexpected love. Some told the story with mockery, unable to move past the visual incongruity of the couple, but others recounted it with warmth, recognizing in Henri and Onata's partnership a truth about human connection that transcended superficial judgments. They became known for their devotion to each other, for the way they moved through the world as true partners despite the stares and comments that never entirely ceased. Over the years, they had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, each inheriting interesting combinations of their parents' characteristics. Their eldest daughter grew to be nearly as tall as Onata, while their youngest son remained compact like Henri, and both children learned early that physical stature meant nothing about worth or capability. The family divided time between Onata's village and a cabin Henri built in prime trapping territory, creating a life that honored both their backgrounds and taught their children to navigate multiple worlds with confidence. Henry's success as a trapper continued, and even expanded as Onata's knowledge of the land and its resources complemented his existing skills. They became known as fair traders who dealt honestly with both native peoples and colonists, building bridges between communities that often viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Their unusual partnership somehow gave them credibility with both sides, as if their willingness to cross social boundaries made them trustworthy mediators who understood the value of looking beyond surface differences. As they aged together, Henri and Onata often reflected on that spring gathering where they had first met, on the unlikely series of events that had brought them together. They marveled at how close they had both come to resigning themselves to permanent loneliness, how easily they might have missed each other entirely if timing or circumstance had been slightly different. Onata admitted she had attended that gathering reluctantly, tired of facing the pity and judgment that such events typically brought her. Henri confessed he had almost skipped it entirely, feeling his usual reluctance to expose himself to the mockery that followed him through settler society. In their final years, after lives well lived and children successfully raised, Henri and Onata became elders whose story was told to young people facing their own struggles with acceptance and belonging. They emphasized that true partnership required seeing past what society deemed important to recognize what actually mattered. That love was not about finding someone who fit conventional expectations, but about finding someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway. They spoke of courage not as dramatic heroic acts, but as a simple bravery of standing tall, of refusing to diminish yourself to make others comfortable, of choosing authentic connection over safe conformity. When Henri died at 73, Onata mourned deeply but without regret, grateful for 47 years of genuine partnership that had exceeded anything she had imagined possible during those lonely years before the gathering. When she followed him 2 years later, she was buried beside him in a place that overlooked both the river valley where they had met and the mountains where they had built their life together. Their children erected a marker that noted simply their names, their years, and the phrase that had become their legacy. She was taller than any warrior, and he smiled and kissed her anyway, a testament to love that recognized what truly mattered. Thank you so much for watching this beautiful story about love that defies expectations and the courage to choose happiness despite what others think. If this tale touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss another inspiring story about authentic connection and the strength it takes to honor your truth. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe that real love sees beyond surface appearances to recognize the soul within. Share this story with someone who needs encouragement to stand tall and be themselves, or with anyone who has ever felt judged for characteristics they cannot control. Leave a comment telling us about relationships you have witnessed that challenge conventions, or about times when you chose authenticity over acceptance. Your stories create a community of people committed to celebrating love in all its beautiful, unexpected forms. Until next time, remember that the right person will see you completely, will value your strengths regardless of how they compare to others, and will choose you not despite your differences, but because of the unique and irreplaceable person you are.